Hi friends, it's Destiny, and today we're going to talk about 10 books that were really special to me over the last decade. I was going to do a favorites of the decade video, but it was too hard to narrow it down to just 10, and I realized that I'd rather talk about 10 books that really impacted me as a person. These are 10 books that changed my life, so I just wanted to share those with you today. To be fair, I say 10 videos, but I'm breaking my own rules a little bit because I want to start off with one honorary mention. It wasn't necessarily life-changing, but it is a book that really was a big moment in my life, if that makes sense. And that's How to Make a Wish by Ashley Herring Blake. This was the first book that I ever saw on-page buy rep in. And that's wild to me because now I see it, still not constantly, but I have seen it many more times since then. And it never stops warming my little buy heart. But this was the first time, and that's always going to be special to me to remember the first time that I was reading a book and I saw myself on page and I was just stunned. If I had had this as a kid, this would have changed my life as a teenager. And so I'm so grateful that there are authors putting out representation today that kids can see themselves in. Now for the actual list, number 10 is going to be Illuminae by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff. I feel like if you read YA, you probably already know what this series is. The Illuminae Files is a YA sci-fi trilogy, and it's known for two things. It's known for its mixed media format. As you can see, there are like dossiers and notes and stuff, but it's also known for its full cast audiobooks. Everybody always raves about the audiobooks. This is a series I love very much. I think I've read the entire trilogy 3 times. Never gets old. But the thing is, one, I thought that I hated sci-fi books until I read this series. And I know that this is not like hard-hitting sci-fi, I know that there is a lot more technical sci-fi out there, obviously, and I still struggle with some of that. But I thought that I absolutely hated sci-fi and that sci-fi was a lost cause for me in books until reading this, with the exception of dystopia. But again, on the audiobooks, also I thought that audiobooks were a lost cause for me. I have ADHD and I did not think that I would ever find an audiobook that could hold my attention well enough for me to enjoy it until I listened to these books, and that was life-changing for me, and it made me finally start branching out, and now I love audiobooks, but it's something that I had to kind of learn how to listen to, and this series is what was my introduction to listening to audiobooks. Next at number 9 is actually the second book in a series. I do love the first book too, but the second book is where I really got sucked into it, and that's Princess Gambit by C.S. Pacat. This is the second book in the Captive Prince trilogy. Not only is this a series that I just love with my whole heart, like this is absolutely one of my favorite series of all time, but it was also a series that taught me not to judge books based on preconceptions and other people's reviews. This was a series that I had no interest whatsoever in picking up because a few friends had told me that they hated it and that they didn't think I should read it, and also because the synopsis did not intrigue me at all. And my best friend had just read them and she binged all 3 of them in a few days, and she talked me into trying them. She was like, just give it a chance. And I went into it with the most pessimistic attitude you could imagine, and I loved it. I was completely enraptured. I read all 3 books in the series in one sitting each over the span of I think about a week. Could not get enough. I've reread the entire series 3 times now. I actually have a rule for 2020 that I'm trying not to reread much because I really want to work on my TBR, but I might have to make an exception for this series because I don't think I could go the whole year without rereading it. Coming in at number 8 is going to be Reign of the Fallen by Sarah Glenmarsh. This is a YA fantasy. It's kind of a dark fantasy, a little bit of a horror element about necromancers. And if the phrase queer necromancers doesn't draw you in the way that it did me, I don't know what to tell you. The second book has a baby dragon if you need more convincing. Not only does it feature a bisexual main character, but it's set in a world where there are a lot of queer characters in this series. It also features the best addiction rep I've ever seen in a book. I don't want to get too personal, but addiction is something that has really affected many members of my family in many different ways. And seeing it portrayed as a genuine illness and something that people have to overcome and have to fight was really powerful for me. This duology also means a lot to me because the second book, Song of the Dead, is also the first book that I ever had my name put in the acknowledgements for. Sarah actually messaged me and asked, how I wanted to be addressed in the acknowledgments, and I remember crying. It meant the world to me. Sarah is such an amazing human being, and I love her to death. And then at number 7, we have Circe by Madeline Miller. This is a retelling of the Odyssey told from Circe's point of view. It dives into a lot of the ways that people treat us and the ways that that shapes who we are as people, and it also deals with themes of being a survivor and even getting justice against your abusers, which is something that I personally find very empowering as a survivor. This is a tough read at times. Circe goes through a lot, but this book really takes this character that we only kind of see as surface value. We only see her as this kind of villain in the Odyssey, and it gives her an identity and a backstory and an opportunity to tell us what turned her into the character that we're familiar with. It also has the greatest themes of motherhood. There are quotes in this book that I remember just weeping over. Like, my son had not been born long before this came out, and I remember sitting there holding him just crying. Like, Madeline Miller got me, you know? And then the other thing that I love so much about Circe is that we get to see this representation of a witch who is not a villain. She's not some silly, super fantastical stereotype. Circe's representation of witchcraft is something that I think a lot of witches that I know, including myself, can really relate to and really see themselves in. There's a depth to the representation of her witchcraft that I have almost never seen in a story before or since this, so that meant a lot to me too. Next at number 6 is Bloodwater Paint by Joy McCullough. This is a novel in verse. It's historical fiction. It's based on the story of Artemisia Gentileschi, who was, I think, a 16th century painter. If you don't recognize the name, when you hear it, look her up on Google because you'll recognize paintings of hers. But Artemisia wasn't only known for her painting, she was also known for the fact that she was an abuse survivor who was abused by her teacher and then actually took him to court over it. And that's something that was totally unheard of at that time, for a woman to actually take her attacker to court and to try to hold him accountable. This is a hard read. When I tell you that no book has ever made me feel as seen as a survivor as this book did, there are lines in this book that I remember sitting there reading and just completely losing it because this book made me so emotional. And to feel this scene in a story and to feel this understood, and I feel like Joy McCullough really gets it. Unfortunately, I think she's also writing from experience, so it makes sense. But it was so powerful to me. And I think about this book constantly. This book, I carry it with me. And I don't think I'll ever get over how incredible Bloodwater Paint is and how much I needed it at the time that it came to me and how much it means to me. On a lighter note, number 5 is A Court of Mist and Fury by Sarah J. Maas. When I tell you that this book changed my life a little bit, I'm serious. I'm not exaggerating. This book came to me at a time when I had this strange concept that I was too old to go hard in a fandom anymore, that I had outgrown being able to just really get so sucked into a fandom and to totally geek out over something. And a lot of it has to do with toxic people in my past convincing me of that, and I had not gotten over that mindset until I read this. I was so drawn into this when I first read it. I remember powering through this entire book in like one sitting, and I was like, oh my gosh, like when I was younger, I was always like that with fandoms and things that I liked. I would always just get totally sucked into things, and I would join fandom websites or Facebook groups or MySpace groups back then and all this different stuff. And this was the first time in years that I have been able to just really absorb into a fandom and say, like, this is my thing, like, I'm obsessed with this, I want to make friends about this, I want to talk to people about it, and I'm not too old for it, and that was huge for me. Number 4 is The Siren and the Spectre by Jonathan Janz. This is my first Jonathan Janz book, which is special in and of itself because he is now my favorite horror author. I'd never actually heard of him until I read this because I was not in the indie horror scene at all. Like, I loved horror. I grew up on horror. I've always loved horror. But I read, you know, Joe Hill, Dean Koontz, like I read the popular names, and I had never read, I don't think I had ever read any indie horror whatsoever until picking up The Siren and the Spectre. I saw this on somebody's Bookstagram post, and I remember being like, that looks really cool, it sounds neat, I'm going to contact the publishers. Contacted the publishers, they sent me a copy right out, and I devoured this. I would have read this literally in one sitting if it weren't for the fact that there is a scene in this book that scared me. And I say this as someone who does not get scared by movies and books. This is literally one of 2 books in my entire life to ever legitimately scare me. But I was so freaked out by a scene about halfway through this book, and if you've read it, you probably know what scene I'm talking about. I slammed the book shut and went to bed. I was done. I could not read anymore. I had to finish it in the daylight because I was so freaked out. So that alone was really cool because it really, to have loved horror for so long, I had definitely reached a point where it was getting stale for me because I was reading the same few authors over and over. But not only did this totally refresh my love of horror, and not only did it introduce me to indie horror, which is where I find almost all of my favorite authors nowadays, it also opened me up to the horror community online. I had had some kind of bad experiences in some Facebook groups for horror fans, and so I kind of disconnected myself from the horror community online until I discovered the indie horror community. And there are so many people on Bookstagram and on Booktube and on Book Twitter who are part of this community, and they're authors and readers, publishers, editors, everyone who is a part of making indie horror happen. And I've met some of the most amazing people. I feel so lucky to have made so many new friends in this community, Jonathan actually being one of them. He's literally one of the nicest people I've ever met in the entire book industry, and I just think he's gonna go really far, and I'm always gonna reference back to The Siren and the Spectre as such an influential read for me, and as a book that I'm so grateful became a part of my life when it did. Okay, and then at number 3, it's A Girl Like Her by Talia Hibbert. A Girl Like Her has a special place in my heart for a lot of reasons, most namely being that it was my introduction to Talia's work. She's now my favorite romance author. I think she's absolutely incredible. You may be more familiar with her most recent release, Get a Life, Chloe Brown, which was actually one of my favorite reads of 2019. She writes the most wonderful, effortlessly diverse stories. The first time that I read A Girl Like Her, I picked it up because I was told that it had a fat, black, autistic main character. And I was completely blown away because that was the first time I had ever even heard of a fat main character in a romance book. I've gone on to read almost everything that Talia has written. I've given everything that I've read by her, I think 4.5 stars or higher. I really love her work so much. I cannot recommend her books highly enough. And then we're almost done. At number 2 is Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Rogerson. I had the hardback too, but I wanted to show this one because I think this is my most heavily tabbed book. Look at all of this, it's ridiculous. I also love this copy a lot because it was actually a personal copy of Margaret's that she sent me. She signed it for me and sent me this cute little postcard. I just completely adore her and everything that she does. Her first book, An Enchantment of Ravens, was also a favorite of mine and almost made this list, but I decided to go with Sorcery of Thorns instead. It paints the most vivid picture of just like a love story to librarians and libraries and books and stories, and it's so magical and it's so wonderful. I have notes of things that I want to say about this book and they just don't suffice. Like there's not enough time to tell you all the reasons why I love this book so much and why it means so much to me. Elizabeth is such an iconic heroine. She's so inspiring. She makes me proud to be a librarian. Nathaniel is an absolute cinnamon roll. He's precious in every possible way. The demon Silas, I don't have enough words to tell you how much I love Silas. Like, there's just nothing that I don't adore about this story. It's everything that I love about stories wrapped up into one book. And finally, for number 1, the book that I consider to have had the most impact on me over the last decade. I don't say this lightly. This was really hard for me to narrow down to a number 1. but I finally had to go with Every Heart a Doorway by Shauna McGuire. This is the first book in the Wayward Children series. More importantly for me, this was the first book by Shauna McGuire that I ever read, and that was genuinely a completely life-changing moment. If I had to pick just one favorite series in the world, it would probably be this one. If there was only one author that I could read for the rest of my life, I would probably pick Shauna. She just writes the most beautiful, completely effortlessly diverse stories. The representation in this series is incredible. The level of imagination and creativity that goes into this is absolutely incredible, but even more than that, Shauna is the one author that every single thing I read by her, I constantly am stuck just sitting, like, processing what I just read, because her writing voice itself is so beautiful. She is probably my single favorite writer. Like, if I was just going off of her actual writing style and the words that she puts on paper, I think she would have to be my single favorite. She writes wonderful characters. And mentioning the series actually feels really timely because just this week she came out with Come Tumbling Down, which is the 5th book in the Wayward Children series, and I think this is actually my favorite in the series yet. Not only did I tab the heck out of it, but I seriously highlighted like half the freaking book. It's so gorgeous. It's so good. It follows Jack and Jill. We get to go back to the moors, which is my favorite world in the Wayward Children series, because this book is really entirely my brand, because the moors are a horror film-esque world, and this book centers pretty heavily on queer women, and it features a couple of really wonderful fat girls and some great moments of body positivity, among other representation. There's a lot to love here, but I just read this recently. I'm still kind of processing it, and the more I think on it, the more I love it, and the more I feel like this might take place as my favorite book of all time. Like, it's entirely possible. Okay, and that's it. Those are the 10 books, plus an 11th bonus mention, that changed my life the most over the last decade. These are books that I feel like, had I not read them, I would genuinely not be who I am today. They're just such special reads to me. They all have such big places in my heart. If you haven't read any of them, I hope that you'll at least consider checking them out. Just in case you want to know more about any of those, I will add links to my Goodreads reviews below so you can check those out too. And that's all I've got for you today. So thank you for checking out my video. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, please click like and subscribe because it does mean so much to me. And I hope to see you in another video again soon. Bye!